so I call this meeting to order at 5:34. We'll start off with roll call. Alejandro.
Here.
Eric.
Here.
Joey.
Present.
Monica.
Here.
Dane.
Here.
Alex is absent. Aubrey's here, right?
Here.
Aubrey's here. Josh.
Here.
Martin's absent. Lacey. I don't know. I'm just going off the minutes.
Here.
I don't have a list. Greg.
Here.
And Jessica.
Here.
And then Brandon's excused. Was Cece excused? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's something Aubrey. Okay. So everybody looked over the agenda, right? I hope so. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I actually have an amendment to the agenda. This is what happens when I'm not paying attention. It says our next meeting is May 13th, but if anyone recalls our schedule at the beginning of the year, we technically have that off since that was source. I'll touch on why we're going to keep it off when we get to the subcommittee reports, but our next meeting should actually be May 20th. So not next Wednesday, the Wednesday after.
So is there a motion to approve the agenda with the amendment?
So moved.
Eric moves. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Alejandro seconds. All in favor? I don't know. How do we say aye or just do the? Okay. Greg did a thumbs up.
We can do either voice or via chat. I don't know if Alejandro and Jessica can use the chat.
Yes.
So just type in the chat. Yes.
There we go. Everyone's saying yes in the chat.
And then Alejandro, do you approve?
Yeah.
All right. Agenda is approved. And then has everybody looked over the minutes from 4/29/2020?
Yep.
Is there a motion to approve?
I motion to approve.
Dane.
Second.
Okay, Eric seconds. And then same procedure, just type in the chat if you approve. So the minutes are approved, and then we'll go on to reports. I don't have any.
I'll touch on more when we get to the old business, just the updates on where we are with things in the plan. I mean, I guess my only other thing, it's really less a report, but other than to say I appreciate everyone's adaptability to making these meetings work in the modality that we are within this. I don't know if anyone had any feedback or went back and kind of watched the video, if anyone has any suggestions or recommendations, if we need to adjust or change anything for how things are working this week or others. Seem to go pretty well, and I'll say especially compared to some other committee and team meetings that I have been attending virtually. So I don't have any adjustments on there. I think it's running smooth, and I'll touch base on where we are with annual reports and base funding. I do want to put in here and make Aubrey have to type this, that I do want to thank Aubrey for getting all of the annual reports and supplemental questionnaires on the website. She did an awesome job with that, and we'll touch on that more when we get to old business. That's all I've got.
Lacey, do you have anything?
And I don't have any updates or reports this week.
So now we'll move on to public comment. Is there any public comment? I don't know. Somebody wants to type in the chat. No? Okay. So on to new business, a subcommittee, and then review and update. So I think that would be me. Me, Eric, and Jessica met, I think it was yesterday. I'm not too sure.
Yesterday.
Okay. And we discussed a couple ideas, you know, and really what we need right now from the rest of the committee is just to have you all approve, I think approve the KPIs that we presented at the last in-person meeting that we had, and then see where we can go from there. You all should have gotten an email earlier from Aubrey that contains an document that Eric drafted up, and
I'll talk about that more when you're done.
okay, yeah. So yeah, we kind of discussed a bunch of different ideas, kind of seeing what we can do with different categories of funding for supplemental, travel events, and Eric said something like special events. It's not final or anything, but it's just an idea to present to the rest of the committee. So I don't know, Eric, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can. Did you all got the document, right?
Yep.
Okay. So what we're talking about is changing the process for supplemental funding requests, and basically what that is to move to a plan that's like the Office of Undergrad Research, where they have 2 entry points a year for people to make requests, and then the OUR sits down and based on their own set of rubrics, they decide whether to fund people's requests. But the gist of this is that we're looking at having shared responsibility, and that shared responsibility for travel or for events is between the student and the school, and the opportunities for funding that they can get from S&A, from OUR or the graduate school career services. We talked yesterday about having basically adopting, for the most part, their travel recommendations that they have. So $750 for one student, up to $750, up to $1,500 for 2 students or more. Having an event, and then, so that's the travel side, and then the event side, having you can request money for events up to $2,500. We have on there large events and special circumstances. So what those are is where the event is going to have a broad-based connection to multiple students on campus. Example being Wild Fest, the athletic department requesting tickets for playoff games because you can't give free tickets. The orchestra going to Washington, D.C. or what have you, but they're going to either be affecting a lot of students in the event on campus, or it's going to be a sizable chunk of students going to an event that has special meaning to the school. In the requests, which would be similar to what are requested now, but they would do an abstract of their event, and then also a professional development and how they're going to bring it back to the school, how it's going to help them, how they're going to bring it back to the school. They have to have a predetermined budget in the application of everything they're going to need, they're going to have for that trip, so the committee can see that information just as they do now. But an additional thing in this new process, which is similar to OUR, is having a letter of support from an academic advisor or a club organization advisor saying that they see value in this event. The purpose of this is to really allow emotions to be removed from the room when we're deciding people's requests. Over my 3 years here on this committee, a lot of my decisions have been based on the emotions of the people sitting in the gallery. Now I just did it, the gallery. And I think if we were to have like a November date, a January or a February date of requests, then the committee can sit and go over all of them from a determined budget that we have. This I think having lower amounts allowed for to get out, I think it's going to extend that roughly $3.5 million of supplemental money that's there currently. this also still uses the great Circuit Accounting to make sure that these requests are allowable under the rules, and they can do a lot of the nitty gritty stuff, saying, hey, you don't have this, why didn't you do this? So when the committee meets to determine funding requests, they can go head on into it and formulate that they're going to support. So there you go. This is not a proposal yet. I would like to take this and move on to working with Lacey and Joey to create a formal proposal for us to make, so it can be sent up the chain to change policy in the future. I know it's a long process, but I think this is where we should go for supplemental funding requests.
Yeah, and they would go hand in hand with the KPIs. We'll be able to use a lot of the KPIs that we came up with, presented the last meeting, in-person meeting, and present that at the same time. One other thing is, along with the KPIs, we really want, if we want to keep track of, how many students use an area or a service or go to an event, I think my recommendation from last meeting still stands true, where we should look into purchasing some type of software or hardware that, or both, that we can, keep track of, I don't know, maybe scanning the barcode on a connection card, right? So doing something like that. And I think that could be a project that can be done between S&A and the Tech Fee Committee, Student Tech Fee Committee. I don't know. Do you all have any thoughts on any of that?
So I have a couple, and then some questions just to kind of clarify where we're at on there. So, one thing before we get too far into it that I think we have to be mindful of is that I think our current circumstances have kind of highlighted is that the way that we have evaluated things, and so doing things like the swipe cards and that type of stuff, may not be feasible, especially in the near future. I know right now at the university on the staff and faculty side, we're discussing what even fall is going to look like. And so I wouldn't want us necessarily to put key performance indicators as the major one, like, so again, attendance and certain things, because those are going to change within some of that. So I think it's not anything we could have anticipated, but us being mindful of there's going to be other things we're going to want to look at within that. I think if we can, and I don't have it here in front of me, but if we can pull back up for at our next in-person meeting what those KPIs are, Edgar, just to kind of go over with the whole committee and send those out. I think that would be helpful, because I do think that was a good point to go off of from there. I think with this, and I guess my question would be, because I think there's a few things with the document sent today. I like where we're going, and I think from what we've talked about before, a lot of this is coming off of just the concerns that we've had about the sheer number of specifically travel supplemental requests, how large those are, not knowing how much growth there is. And I guess I'll kind of bring up a twofold part. One, for the immediate future, there will be no travel, given the travel restrictions, and we don't know how long that is going to last for. We know at least for the next bit of time that may continue through fall quarter as we're looking at it. So I guess my question, before I get into just my feedback in terms of some of this, is do we want to create a process, because I know throughout the year, and we started the subcommittee back in the fall, is there was really two things we were looking at and discussing. One was identifying some key performance indicators, primarily for our base funding groups, which I think that's the other piece that you presented before in our last meeting of winter quarter, Edgar. And then the other one was really trying to identify a better process for supplemental requests, but specifically for travel. And I know there's various opinions. There were some people who felt we shouldn't handle any of the travel, those shouldn't be coming here, and other requests. Knowing, which Eric kind of mentioned, that what's proposed here would require a change in policy. But is the thought process really that we would change all supplemental funding to be in this route. And I say that because even what you mentioned under the to be determined of the price part, large events and special circumstances are going to be different than some of these. But I think where I know some conversation was before, and I remember back in the fall, is about, do we have specifically for travel, because those have to be planned in advance. You have to get certain travel authorizations in those. Do we set up a protocol, which would still potentially require some changes to policies? Do we set up a protocol that are for travel supplemental requests? And I will share, and this is kind of getting the cart before the horse on this, is that knowing these changes would not go necessarily into effect until partway through next year due to policy changes. I do know there is discussion amongst some of the base funding groups on changing or looking at, can we alter our base funding to try and move all travel requests, for the most part, down to those units that we've already allocated money to before. So like the music department, student involvement for the club travel, those types of things. So there are some other conversations that may address some of that. But is the issue supplemental in general that we're looking at? Or is it really the travel part? Because I heard a lot about travel more and the concerns about travel more than I did supplemental in general, which we don't get a lot that aren't travel. I mean, if you look back, not only this year, but previous years, and I know Lacey has some data. I know Brandon, and I don't think he shared it with the committee yet. He spent some time over the break pulling up some nice graphics showing the different types of reports that we have. That I'll ask him at our next meeting if he's at a spot where he can share that to show you. But travel really takes up the majority. So are we looking at them all together, or are we looking at travel as a separate one?
Go ahead, Eric.
I guess this document was literally just to get the conversation started, and I think it really is travel. I included events because I think when we're getting inundated with travel, and then we get this giant event coming, like say Foss's event they wanted to do this last April, or Wild Fest, is we're considering them along with the 30 travel ones that are going on, and they come out maybe to the same amount of money, anecdotally, and we're like, oh my gosh, how do we weigh? So those were just added as kind of an overall suggestion for discussion. But yeah, travel really is the most important part of this piece. So I don't know if that necessary, that and moving from a weekly request and the next week vote to 2 dates that are deadlines, you get your request in, and then the committee. So maybe that's the policy changes, that, and not having where it's every week. So we as a committee can do other things that we need to do.
Can I say something? Does that eliminate like presentations? So do we not hear from people coming in now since we have only the 2 days? How does that work?
So the presentations would be gone, and it would eliminate those, and that's where having the abstract, the letter of support, the professional development, how it's going to help you, how you're going to bring that back to help students here at Central. Those things would, and they would actually have to, this is not just writing on a piece of paper, we're going to learn about science. You would have to have an in-depth description. And in those, of course, we will have, the committee would have to look at, formulate our questions for when we get together to decide who to fund. That's just an idea.
Yeah. Well, and I'm jumping in, Edgar. I was looking to see if anyone else was moving. Oh, Lacey has her hand. I'll wait.
I was just gonna say, so some of the things that Eric was talking about, referencing, the breakdown of if it's one traveler, it's a certain rate versus, and it kind of adds on. So it's $750 and then so forth and so forth. My question that's probably primarily for Joey would be, can these suggestions or, points being brought forward, can those be suggestions to the future committee as opposed to a policy change? Can we have basically a sub document that could be used as a reference tool, and that the committee could at the beginning of the year, review that and say, I'm okay with the 750 and the 1500 and whatever these dollar figures are on these parameters, and then they can vote accordingly based off of, maybe a first couple of trainings that could just be more parameters as opposed to a policy change, I guess, is the question that I have.
Yeah, and that's actually roughly what I was going to touch on. Would be my recommendation. Actually, is what was that, Eric?
Oh, I just said I like that.
Oh, yeah, and that's what I was going to say is my recommendation. And I know this wasn't necessarily a proposal, but just for the sake of the committee to have some conversations, I would not recommend putting any caps or anything like that into policy, only because that absolutely limits us. So if we get something that for some reason the committee unanimously is like, no, we absolutely want to do something outside that, we can't without it getting changed. And so what I would say is, whatever we decide here to kind of split, here's what we would recommend to the future, next year's, and again, next year we may not have travel, so maybe the year after that, is that we have something like this to look at and say we would recommend having and setting at the beginning of the year, and use this kind of as a model that the committee would internally decide. But it does give the committee the flexibility if we do have those special circumstances. It's kind of down there, that is that ambiguous term, to say, here's what we would like to do. I mean, I think the part, and this kind of goes back a little bit, which we touched on briefly, of what supplemental funding is really intended to be versus what it has grown into be, is we've ended up in the spot that really supplemental funding and what the committee has done, like our main priority is the base funding that we do out there. Supplemental funding was really the ability primarily for base funded groups, but also other student things to come in to request things outside of the norm. Now, again, this was created back when there wasn't necessarily a pot of money set aside for supplemental. It would be whatever excess we could use to provide an avenue, and where it has grown over time, because committees in the past did build that in essentially as every year we're going to pull this out. It's grown and grown into this travel fund. And I think everyone, it seems to be, is in a similar boat that is really not the most effective means of doing that or use of time. So, I mean, my recommendation would be almost to say, let's set aside for travel specifically something like this type of process, of where for travel requests, regardless of size, that those need to be submitted by a deadline, so all travel is looked at together. Because events are going to be so very different, right? Like even the events this committee has seen, they're drastically different in terms of size and scope and things like that. So those can be a little bit more looked at individually. And I think those would also be harder to quantify without the ability, as Dane was going back to, of asking questions of who's putting on the event. To where travel is pretty uniform. I mean, where are you going? Why are you going? What are you getting out of it? Regardless of what we've seen over the years, those are the things we want to know. And so on my end, and again, for you all to kind of think and talk, is I would almost, and I'll talk about what that means policy-wise, I would almost say, let's look at creating and using this type of template for the process for travel that may come to the S&A committee. Because that allows, again, if we're moving most travel elsewhere, this should cut down. But those requests that we may get that fall under the travel category, maybe we are going to review those one meeting once a quarter. And so all travel that quarter will be looked at together. And then it is more consistent in terms of how that money is being allocated, because we know what we have for that. On that side, I mean, the only part on there that would be a change, which goes back to what Dane, I think, was asking, is in our policies, it does say that supplemental requests, which it has them all as blanket, all supplemental requests follow the same model as base funding, which is they have the opportunity for a 10-minute presentation and 10 minutes of questions and answer. So if we were to move with what I just said, we would really create a subset in there saying that supplemental requests for travel expenses would be on a different model. I mean, that's my thought, but again, I would recommend that we don't put any dollar amount or caps into the policy, because as you all know, it's such a pain to change that policy. It just doesn't give the committee the flexibility that it may need as we look at it. But we can absolutely use that. Whatever final piece we get, we can have a part based on what we come forward of. Here's the policy change we need to make, given what we decide, but also here's the recommendations to next year's committee, which is kind of also where the KPIs go next year. Is new committee next year as they're coming in, here's the work that the committee did last year, here's their recommendations on KPIs for the base funding as we're looking at that, and here's their recommendations on supplemental requests, specifically with travel, how we do those. Did that answer your question, Lacey? I know I went way off tangent beyond that, but I think I covered it at the start.
Yes, I do. I think that did make sense. And I think maybe kind of adding on to what Joey had said is maybe we can, get a document similar to, what you had kind of put together, Eric, and just present it to the committee next year and say, these are some of the parameters that we felt were relevant and important to our situation. And maybe it can just be a tool that they can, so instead of maybe like a paper, maybe think of it as a tool that they can utilize when they're going through those requests, regardless of how they are reviewing the paper or the presentation.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
So I'm kind of just thinking out loud here a little bit because I had some other thoughts on this, and kind of going through this now for a couple of years and knowing I'm going to be here next year. And this idea that, well, here's this recommendation, you can see. I feel like it's the same as it ever was. It'll be just the same as it's always been. And I don't know if there's a different way to word this than to be more of a guideline. Because it just, in looking at this, my first response was, okay, one student, $750, two or more, $1,500. So if I have 12, it's still only $1,500. So all of a sudden that seems odd. So then if I have 12, then that's a special circumstance, right? So then it's going to be kind of whatever it's always been. And so that, but what Joey said about we shouldn't put a dollar amount on there, because I feel strongly about that too, because there are things that are going to cost more than $750 per student, and then we're only going to those students that can afford the rest of it are going to get to go on these wonderful experiences, and those that don't have the money stay home. And so I don't know if we're serving everybody that way, but again, I don't know, other than going broke every year like we do, what the other option is. But these are things I think we should consider, because I don't want to cut out those that don't have the money to supplement the rest of it.
Eric?
I don't want to cut out anybody either. I just, from listening to people this year and previous years, travel's really been a struggle for many of us. And, how do we justify supporting one and not the other? So like I said, this paper was just a suggestion to start the discussion. And, I definitely don't want to leave out students that aren't able to pay. So I really like the idea of creating a guiding document for next year's committee to say, hey, this is what we're suggesting without the totals. We hope, yada, 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 and go from there. Yeah, that's where it's at.
Joey.
It's a weird thing to be muted and then wait for Edgar to unmute to call on. So, and I realized as I pointed at Eric that may not be Eric on everyone's screen that I'm pointing at. So
it's Eric.
Now I totally lost my train of thought. The part of the travel and stuff for next year. I mean, I think that's really, Greg, of where we can spend some time, and with the recommendation from the committee, is helpful when we do the planning before the year gets started with the committee to say, hey, here's the recommendations, and it may not be this. It may be when we're talking for those few, because again, ideally, we will see less. But if we are looking at travel, is it that the committee's talking about putting maybe it's not for 2 more, but it's like, we're not going to fund more than X amount per student. So whether you have 1 student or 20 students or 50 students, it's still only going to be that dollar figure or what it may be. I think the ideal situation I know that we've been discussing and looking at is really moving travel out to those areas that we have funded in the past. I think, and where Lacey and I are trying to have conversations with those units is, because as you all have seen, and I'll use music as a great example, right? We see music groups come forward who say, yep, there's no more money. Music has already allocated their money, so we're coming to S&A. Is really, I think, the intent behind supplemental funding, the way that, and again, I'm speculating because I have not been on the committee that long to go back to the start of the policy, but I think the intent was, great, if music travel has money and they run out of money, that it would really be them coming as a base funded unit to say, hey, we need more money and we need another $100,000. And it's like, great, we're going to give you that. That's all you get. But not that we'd be seeing these one-offs necessarily, that we would only see pretty like exceptions to the rule. But I think the idea from what's being looked at from the policy side and from feedback from all of you on the committee really is that some of these pieces should be handled at those levels where we funded them before. We're just seeing it because, and we saw this last year. I mean, for those who were on last year and this year, we saw it last year and some trickle over this year of the changes to club funding and then them running out of money. We saw more people coming here, and the questions really are, does that make the most sense? Or should it be that that group is coming, we're giving club funding more money, and they're still handling it with their process so it's consistent? So, I mean, I don't think this is a magic solution. I think there's some more discussion, but again, I think we're in a spot now where we can take advantage of this because travel is pretty much put on pause. Like, there is no travel right now, with some very few exceptions. So it gives us the ability to really look at it, restart kind of the process, look at where we're at. So when things do get up and going again, we can have it set aside where everyone's on the same page. We also have the benefit of these recommendations are going into groups as they're going to be submitting their base funding requests next year, because all of those are going to come forward. And I think that if the committee next year is in the same mindset of, no, we want this unit to be handling these, then that means that the base funding needs to go to that area to handle those. But that'll be up to the committee next year for that. And I just want to point out, for those who aren't checking their email, Edgar did send out to everyone the KPI document that was shared at the last meeting back in March. So I don't know if anyone has any conversation or discussion on that document now that that Edgar sent it back out, for those who have it in front of you or not. But I think we did a good job back in March, but I don't know if there's any refresher needed for anyone or anything left with that. But I just wanted you to know Edgar sent it out. Thank you, Edgar.
Is there any more like discussion on it, or do you have any more questions? Anybody? Wow, everybody's so attentive. All right, so then I guess we'll move on to next steps. What are the next steps? Or I don't know if we already decided. Is that just blended in with everything else?
Yeah, I think you kind of covered it in there. Really what my idea was, like, here's review, here's what we've been doing. Are there next steps? It sounds like from what Eric was saying and some of the feedback is maybe it is the touching base. We can go back based on kind of the conversation tonight, fine tune and tweak some things. And then based on what that looks like, we can talk about at our next meeting to make sure everyone's on the same page. One, is this what we want to put forward next year? And then what, if any, policy changes might we need to do within that? But I don't know if there's other thoughts. I know it was the three of you who were at the meeting, so I don't know if Jess had anything else on there as well.
I kind of covered everything.
Okay, well, I suppose we'll move on. So old business, base funding program reviews updates.
Yeah. So we got, and I'm still waiting on a couple of them. They had until this Friday, so no one is past due yet. We got most of them already in. My plan is ideally to send them all to you all at once, so you're not getting multiple emails you're searching through. But I'll shoot all of them out so you all have the ability to look at them in advance. This kind of goes to what I was referencing earlier, that again, we're not meeting next week, since that already at the beginning of the year schedule said we weren't meeting. But it really does give us the opportunity, because it's essentially going to be like you all in the committee have homework for the next 2 weeks. Is really that the intent would be not only that you look over those base funding program reviews, and we'll go over those on the meeting on the 20th. And so I'll let each of those units know, hey, we're going to bring them up. You all have seen it. So if there is questions or discussions, they can choose to sign in. It's, again, not going to be a requirement. But I'll send those out to you once we get them all on Friday in one email, or I'll have Aubrey send it out, one of us will, so you all can look at all of the funding program reviews. And really, they're answering the 6 questions that we always ask them to. And then I have let them know, given the fact they're not presenting in person, that if they would like to, they can give a brief description of what their program is. Hopefully you all know what it is we're funding, but in the event that you're like, I have no idea, they're going to include some of that. So the plan for that would really be to look over those before our next meeting. We'll pull them up so that way, if there are questions on the program reviews, you all have the chance, we can discuss them as a committee, but also potentially ask them of the individual program managers when those come up. So that's really the plan for the program reviews. Again, I think for the most part, everyone's been really communicative and working on them, getting them in there. I'll be honest, those who are brand new, because we do have some new base funding groups who have never done a program review before. So they've asked a lot of great questions about it. I think it's more nerve-wracking for those who are used to doing it in person, because now they have to create something that you all are going to have. So they're a little nervous about that. So just be mindful. But before I jump into annual reports, are there questions about the base funding program reviews? Again, I know it's kind of giving you all homework. We're not going to meet next week, and they won't take long. They're all really brief to look at. But I'd ask that you go through them and kind of jot down any questions you might have, or any things that may come up from it, so we can have those in advance. Seeing none, I'll just transition directly into the annual report. And so Aubrey did do a great job. If you go to the website, you can see that she has them all pulled up. And actually, I don't know if I can share my screen, and I will show you where all of these are. And mostly because the other part is going to be, this is the other homework that you all are going to have. Now I have far too many things on my computer that are open. Here we go. So this is the agenda, and now I can't see my little, here we go. Can you all see my screen? Okay, Edgar's nodding, Eric's nodding. So if you go to the S&A website, and again, we have a link on this, but the annual financial reports on here, if you go down to them, every unit is on here. And so, for example, Academic Advising West Side, if you go to each of these, you'll see that there's the base request, which is actually what their request was almost 4 years ago. Their report from last year, so the one they submitted last year, and then the 2019 is the one that you all are going to want to look at. 2018 is already going to be included in the 2019. So really, for you all to take a look at each of the annual financial reports for 2019, we've also uploaded the supplemental questionnaire that the subcommittee created back in the fall. Just for reference as well. It has those additional questions we touched on. And so each one, if you go to them, like I'll skip down here and we'll go campus activities, they all have 2019 and the supplemental questionnaire. And so when you pull it up, it'll have the actual narrative at the start of it. And then you scroll down, it has the financials. And I'll say this because you're all going to be looking at this individually, is when you look at it, it has, and it'll go from the right-hand side to the left. Fiscal year 18 is the actuals that happened. Fiscal year 19, which is last year's, their actuals. And then fiscal year 20, which is our current year we're in, our actuals as of the time when they did this, so back in December, and the forecast for the rest of the year. And then it shows you what was the anticipated forecast for next year. So it's showing the whole 4-year base funding cycle for all of these. So when you take a look at these, I mean, really kind of the homework for this is to go through and review all of the annual reports, really to take a look at it. And really the question, the part that I would have for you all is that as you go through them, because I don't want us necessarily to have to go through each one of these individually during the meeting. Because some of these, I'll be honest, I know I've gone through all of them. I know Lacey's gone through all of them. Aubrey has now gone through all of them because she had to combine them all together. Is I know that I don't want to necessarily use the time to go through all of those like that. I would rather have us go through and you all look through them, and then you essentially submit questions or discussion points you may have. Because there may be some that there's going to be no discussion point on. You're like, great, that's straightforward. There may be others where you're like, what does this mean in their answer? Or why do they have this fund balance? Or what is the plan of this? So that we either, and if you all can submit those ideally by next Friday, so that way if there are questions I need to ask the program managers, I can send them out. But at least to bring them to the S&A meeting on the 20th. So that way we'd have another meeting after that, another business meeting. And so if things do come up, we can invite those groups. And so if there's something specifically, we'll say for student involvement, and we need to ask Jeff to come in because we have some questions about his annual report, we have the ability to do that. But I want to make sure that we're spending the time discussing what you all are noting and having questions about. So it does kind of involve you all taking a look at those. And I know some of you already have questions, some things you all have already looked at. I know the subcommittee has discussed some of this as well, but just for the general group to take a look at on there. But before I pass over, I do just want to again say thank you to Aubrey for getting all those posted, since I asked her to do that last Friday and she got them all very quickly done. And it looks like Lacey has a question.
So I just wanted to point out that Joey went over it pretty quickly, but those financial reports were populated in December. And as you guys can know and understand, is a lot of the financial forecasts have changed dramatically since then. And that would be primarily for fiscal 20 and then some forecasts for fiscal 21 as well. So I would just remind the committee that you guys are really looking at fiscal 19 and that data, not to say you can't ask questions about the future projections, but just be mindful that there's going to be certain things in there because things were a lot different about 6 months ago.
Does anyone have anything else to add? No? So we'll move on to other business communications received. Clearly, I haven't received anything. Does anybody else? So then public comment, second call. Is it Eric?
This is a question for Lacey and Joey, I guess, or one of you can answer it. On one of the lists that we would have had for requests was iPads for the committee. I know there's no spending going on right now, but is that something that we can get an exception for, or is that just wait till next time?
iPads and t-shirts, right?
To answer your question, Eric, so that was a request that was primarily, kind of being presented from myself. And I think with the current situation, I can kind of reevaluate and see if there are savings that could potentially kind of offset that. I wouldn't say it's 100% off the table. And I think we're just kind of waiting to see what the future is going to hold. But I could see a pretty justifiable case if we continue in the manner that we have, that could be an allowable purchase.
Okay, I was just curious.
Well, and the one thing I do want to just point out, because it is something that impacts, which is new, but that the committee put in effect last year, is that with the policy being updated this year, is we do have the ability, contrary to previous years, and we're kind of doing some preemptive planning on this, is if we do have a need for the S&A committee to come together for something, in advance that student government over the summer has the ability to appoint a temporary committee to come in. So if we do have things like that, and we do have a better sense of where we're at financially, and if we do say, yep, that's a need, and we get the exception, or it looks like we might get the exception, we can always have the committee over the summer take a look at it and move that forward so it's ready for the fall, which we have not had that ability in the past.
So to sum up, Eric, I would say even though it's not necessarily going to be in the same fashion as a supplemental request, I wouldn't say that it would be off the table.
Great, because I think it's wonderful for reducing paperwork.
Are there any other comments? Public comments? Nope. Seeing none, we'll move on to adjournment. So quick. Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So
Dane?
moved.
Okay. Eric moves, Dane seconds. All those in favor, type in the chat for something. Sweet. The motion passes.
Don't forget to do your homework next week. We're not meeting. Review all those documents. And our next meeting is on Wednesday, the 20th.
Yeah. Okay.
So be safe.
Be safe, everybody. Bye.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend.